Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. One of the main reasons I wanted to have you was because of your vast experience in the pharma industry, but also sort of you've taken a very unique path in which I'll let you explain yourself, but you've taken
Okay.
into sort of academia and you have a variety of sort of skills and knowledge that I think will be quite interesting for people to hear about. Um, but if you could just introduce yourself and sort of give us a bit of a background of who you are and what sort of journey you've been on, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah, definitely. And again, thanks for having me. I'm happy to share my experience with others. And everybody's got a different path, so I think we can all learn from the different variety of ways people get to where they are and what they learned along the way. So I think it's a terrific opportunity. So I'll give you kind of the brief overview, and then we can sort of dive into any area, any section that you want to. But I started out in the pharmaceutical industry kind of in a really traditional way here in the US. I started in a sales role where I was, visiting doctors in rural West Virginia in the US, and telling them about the products that our company had to offer and what some of the benefits and risks are for their patients and how it could really help improve their patients' lives. But in that role, I always knew I wanted to get into a marketing role. I always wanted to figure out kind of what was the strategy behind both the development of the innovations that we brought to patients, and especially the way we communicated about our products and how we brought those um, different attributes of the products to life for customers. So I was always interested in that. That kind of driving curiosity kind of led me to that. So I went into our company headquarters and did a series of developmental roles that eventually led me to product management and marketing roles, where I worked in a variety of different disease areas. Again, just to have the opportunity to get a view on different therapeutic areas, and then from there developed into customer management roles, looking at the managed care and payer audience here in the US, and then looking at it from a global perspective as well. That led me to a brand leadership roles where I was a US brand leader for a few of our products, and then a global brand leader for one of our products in diabetes. And that kind of led me to, really thinking about what's important in terms of how we develop the evidence for customers that support the use of our products. And that led me to a research operations role, where I managed a large team of project managers that helped develop the value evidence for our products so that we could take that to largely to payer audiences to really underscore, why were we developing the innovations that we were and how that could bring value to individual patients, to populations, and to health systems. And then from there, I eventually left the company I was working with, and started my own consulting practice, which is what I'm doing now, consulting with small and mid-size pharma and healthcare companies on their marketing strategy and how they bring value to their customers and their patients. Also kind of developed along the way a path in academia, where now I teach marketing to MBA students here, and also teach about the global pharmaceutical industry as an elective class, because in our area in the US, in this kind of Northeast corridor, there's a lot of different pharmaceutical companies, and a
Yeah.
lot of people want to, learn about, how drugs are developed, the regulatory environment, the marketing, and the manufacturing, and even the pricing strategy behind pharmaceutical paths. So I'm able to apply kind of my 30 plus years experience in the industry,
Yeah.
and hopefully kind of teach the next generation of talent what the industry is all about, and then also teach marketing broadly, across industries to really understand what goes into that strategic thinking.
Thank you. That's such an extensive sort of different levels of experience you bring and from different perspectives as well. And I think one of the things that I found very interesting when I was looking at your sort of profile was you went from a very marketing oriented background to research operations. How how did you find that shift? Because or did you find a challenge when you made that shift? Because I mentioned it's so different from an outsider's perspective. What type of challenges did you see when you made that change?
Yeah, so it's funny because like the reason I made that change and then what I ended up doing were actually two different things. So the reason I made the change and wanted to make the shift from, kind of a traditional marketing perspective was the shift that was happening in the industry at the time. So it was about 10 years ago, where, there was a significant shift in focus from, kind of the traditional promotion, messaging, personal selling to, really thinking about the impact that public policy and market access has on the ability for a scientific-based company to deliver innovations to patients. So that shift was happening, and I was, kind of career-wise in the mode of sort of the traditional marketing of, what messages do we develop and what audiences should we target and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to learn more about this policy access area. And I looked at one way to do that was this opportunity that arose at my company to take on a kind of business leader operational role in the area of our research division that did all of the evidence to build value for our customers. And so to me, it was a little bit of kind of a hybrid role, a way to sort of maintain that kind of business strategy background and experience that I had while really learning about this market access and value area. Really thinking about what types of studies, beyond the traditional, phase 2, phase 3 studies that we all think about in terms of drug development, the types of studies and research that need to be done to really demonstrate the economic impact that products can have for populations and for health systems. So it was a way for me to do that because I'm not a PhD scientist. I'm not a health economist or a statistician. I don't have that background, and so it was a way for me to really learn about that and get closer to the science and the scientists there. So that was the reason I did that, and then I kind of became really aware of the importance of running that type of organization with highly rigorous operations. And I sort of woke in me the operational side and really thinking about how do we create this portfolio of hundreds of millions of dollars of research and do that in the most effective, efficient, fastest, scientifically rigorous, and regulatory compliant way possible, right? So it's this mix of different challenges that you have to optimize all of those different levers in order to be really effective, and that really kind of appealed to me from a different sort of intellectual curiosity point of how to do that, and so as I sort of built the team and started to really understand the importance of operational excellence in order to deliver rigorous science that our customers were requiring in order to make their decisions. That became another set of really great challenges for me from a professional perspective.
Yeah. It's interesting you mention that because you're stepping into such a different world of perception because as you mentioned, you're going from a state of marketing where you're looking at things, what message can I deliver, to then thinking, what is the path that we need to create or to understand where, the deeper meaning of where we're generating that data from. So was there any sort of, how do you decide then the areas that we want to focus on, right? So whether it be in some cases oncology or diabetes, or how do you sit there and say, well, I have X amount of money. I want to create a strategy to target this particular area. How do you make that decision? Or, how do you go about doing something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know that we got it right every single time. We did the best we could to get it right. But I think part of what I was able to bring to that role was the kind of marketing thinking and the kind of strategic frameworks around marketing. So when you talked about how do you prioritize a research budget like that, and how do you figure out where are you going to allocate your finite set of research dollars in order to answer the questions that the customers have. It does start with some of the marketing fundamentals of where is the opportunity? Where is the opportunity to bring your innovations to the most patients possible that that you can benefit the patients and the population and potentially the health systems. So it starts with that of where the opportunity is, and then how do you define what the information needs are of those customers? So if you're going to, a managed care customer in the U.S. or a payer outside the U.S., what are the questions that they have? What evidence needs do they have to satisfy the question so that they'll say, oh yeah, that innovation or that intervention is really valuable. It is, this much better than the current standard of care that's available, and therefore, I'm willing to pay for it. So it is kind of asking those questions, and it's very similar kind of what I did in marketing for all those years is, you're asking the questions of what does the customer need? What is the unmet need that they have? And then how can what you have, what you're offering how can it fulfill that need? And then on the, scientific research side and the research operations side, it's, how do we get that to them in a way that is going to be, of a high enough evidence standard that enables them to make the decision? Have we taken out all of the, confounding variables? Have we studied this in a rigorous way? Have we done the statistical analysis where we're able to show a demonstrable benefit? So all of those things kind of came together. So it actually became, quite natural for somebody to like me to play that role of, how do we set up the right strategic framework? And then, the scientist would then design the right scientific study design protocol in order to answer the question in a rigorous way. So it ended up being like a really nice match. It was not something that I had foreseen prior to
Yeah.
taking the role, but it actually ended up being a really nice match for that role.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned that because I think a lot of the times so my basic training was in sort of pharmaceutical science and developing different formulations. And a lot of the times, young scientists, we don't necessarily understand that sort of strategic thinking because it's a case of you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. But actually what you're saying is, or to give that product an opportunity to grow and flourish, you need to kind of have that marketing hat on and understand your landscape and think about where there is an opportunity and what can be plugged and filled with research that you can then provide. And it gives you that support because otherwise you're just creating things that might not necessarily be needed.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. It's when you talk about the marketing hat. I think of it like for the scientists and even for the marketers, like we both need to be able to wear each other's hats,
mm,
and sometimes at the same time. You bring up the exact point that we encountered a lot was, when talking to, some of the scientists, they wanted to do a study or an analysis that they thought was really scientifically interesting. And I'm sure it was. But if the study is really scientifically interesting, but doesn't necessarily answer one of the questions that a customer has and isn't going to generate evidence that enables them to make a well-informed decision for either their individual patient or for their health system, then maybe that's not something that we want to prioritize doing, that type of study. And so it's having the conversations with the scientists about how do we do both? How do we do a work that is scientifically interesting, good, rigorous evidence standard, and enable us to answer questions that customers have, right? How do we hit all three corners of that triangle to
yeah,
be able to do that and not just one of them? And that was a conversation that we had many times.
yeah, I can imagine that being it, it could be quite challenging, I think, at times, because especially when if you're a pure scientist and you're not too familiar with that other side of things, you've got an idea, and which is part and parcel of being a scientist, you have to be convinced to an extent that this is something you really want to do.
Yeah.
So, did you ever come into conflict or challenges with that, where you sort of had to negotiate with scientists to sort of find a midpoint?
We did, especially in the beginning when I first stepped into the role over in research, because the way that our organization was set up was it was at that time rather siloed, right? You had your kind of commercial customer facing people, and then you had your kind of research, science
Yeah,
lab facing people, right? To just put it plainly, and it wasn't until the time when we really started to implement these cross-functional teams that were by therapeutic area or even by product, where we had somebody from each functional area kind of representing their discipline and representing their idea, so that people kind of came together in this small product development team to really look cross-functionally at all of the different paths that a product has to take on its way to development. So you had somebody who was, in charge of clinical studies, for example, and somebody who was in charge of regulatory, somebody from manufacturing, somebody from marketing, kind of all coming together, and at that point, kind of taking off their functional area lens and looking holistically at what has to happen. And so once the company sort of adopted this culture of this really strong cross-functional collaboration, then people stopped thinking about only their area, right? Like from a marketing perspective, when I was in the marketing role on one of these teams, I stopped thinking about only what's best for something that's going to be able to inform a message that I want to put out there. And I started thinking about, oh, well, if I want to do that, I have to do a clinical study, or I have to do a post hoc analysis, or I have to do a network meta-analysis in order to answer that question. And then I need to turn to my scientific experts to say, well, is that even feasible? Is that how much is that going to cost? How long is that going to take? Right? I started thinking about things a little bit different way. Not that I was doing that job for them, but it helped inform my decisions. And just as my clinical colleague or outcomes research or health economics colleague would think differently about, oh, well, the customer is not really asking me that question, so why am I answering this question that I think is interesting? And people just got a lot better at it as time went on. But it was a real part of learning as an organization how to do that better. So we did have those kind of conflicts and those kind of
Yeah.
discussions. But then once sort of we all stepped into this new way of thinking cross-functionally, that really helped. It's not that they disappeared, of course, but
Yeah.
but it really helped, and it really helped us kind of understand the other functions a lot better.
One of the things that I think really piqued my curiosity as well when we first met, you mentioned a lot of your passions were about mentorship
Yeah.
and sort of, you teach as well alongside with your consulting business. What do you think is the role of mentorship, or how has mentorship affected your career
Yeah.
over, the course of your profession?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably speak on this for another couple of hours, but I think of it both ways. I think of the value that mentors have brought to me
Yeah.
first, and how I was shaped by mentors on a couple of levels, right? So I think of some of the formal mentors that I had that I really relied on over the years, that were either former managers or former bosses of mine that I kind of kept in touch with, that I really valued their opinions, that I could easily go to with a particular, business problem or professional relationship problem that I was having, and get a different perspective, right? For me, it's all about getting a different perspective, and having somebody that I had, really good relationships with, that would tell me to, stop and think about something a different way, or at least look at it a different way. And having the ability to go to, and it wasn't a lot, right? It was, maybe two or three people that I, really trusted, and I went to, pretty consistently. That was really important to me, and understanding the value that has, and the way that the mentors, kind of treated me, and always, were open to my questions, and always listened to me very carefully before providing input or providing feedback, or giving their perspective. That was, really thoughtful and formative for me. I also had a couple of mentor relationships that didn't work out so well. And so I think one of my valuable lessons is, if a mentor relationship is not working out well, then it's okay to end it, right? It's okay to, or let it fizzle out, right? You don't have to necessarily break up with someone,
Yeah.
but it's okay to let it fizzle out, because not every mentor relationship is going to be, a lifetime, or last your whole career. So those were a couple of things that were really important learnings for me as a mentee. And then what I tried to do is kind of translate that as I kind of took on more roles of increasing responsibility, where I found, again, there were two ways for me that I developed relationships as a mentor. One was through some, kind of formal sponsored mentorship programs. And it was a bit like, being matched up with somebody and saying, okay, for the next year, you're going to act as this person's mentor. And it was pretty structured. It was, we would, meet live once a month, and maybe talk on the phone in between those times. Always open for emails or chats or text messages or whatever in between. But it was very formal and structured, even to the point where some of the monthly meetings had sort of suggested topics to discuss, right? And so that was very formal and structured, and there was value to be gained from that. I think from both sides was, having, sort of a set time, making time for it, and not, putting it off till, the next month, or put it off to later, or maybe I'll put it off till I have like a real big problem that I want to discuss. You really got to know the person, on a more consistent basis, and kind of really understand kind of what they were all about, how they thought about things. And so there was real value there as well. And then from my perspective in that role as a mentor, learning about what's on the mind of, these kind of up and coming folks in development, really helped my perspective as a manager. At that point, I was leading an organization of about 100 people. It got me thinking that, well, maybe there are more people on my team who think this way or are facing some of these problems. So I felt like it made me a better leader overall. And then, besides those structured programs, there are also some unstructured programs, right? I would have people, call me up, or, want to grab lunch or grab coffee or whatever, and just have a chat. And then, and through that chat, through catching up, I kind of, would be able to uncover, well, they do have this issue, right, that they're dealing with, whether it's, their manager or coworker, or somebody's not responding to their emails, or, they're really trying to, get ahead, or maybe they're, interviewing for a new role, and they want some advice on how to interview. And so all of those things kind of came up through those more informal channels, that I thought, were also, really beneficial to really kind of understand them, and then have them get additional advice. And then another way that I've been mentoring is through, my work at the university in mentoring some of the MBA students. Again, through, either students who were in my class, or students who, were alumni of the university that kind of find me on LinkedIn or whatever, have, sort of guidance and coaching conversations with them as well. And also enable them to access, other folks in my network too, so that I can, kind of link them up with that are also open to chats. That's one thing that I think is really important, is, reaching out to people and connecting with folks, even if you don't know them. Sometimes you have to overcome that fear a bit of reaching out to somebody, that you don't know. But, I think 9 times out of 10, it's really worthwhile.
Yeah, I think there's a few points you've made there that I thought were absolutely fascinating. So the first thing you said, which I've never heard anybody say before, is ending a relationship of mentorship. I've never heard that before, because everybody talks about the importance of mentorship, right?
Yeah.
Whoever you talk to, whether it be a colleague or a senior, it's always the case of you need mentorship because they help provide you with advice, and pretty much what you've just said, right? But then what happens when that relationship is unproductive to you? And that's what you've just said, is that it's okay to let things fizzle out. When do you then decide this isn't the relationship for me, or that this isn't the mentor that I want, sort of guiding my future? When do you do that?
Yeah. And I'll just speak to my personal experience, because I only had this happen to me one time. It was when I got a sense from the interactions that the interactions were just me, and that I felt that the mentor was kind of giving me signals that he was just no longer interested. And it came from, just cues of, well, the meeting or the session I had scheduled would get postponed, and then it would get postponed again. And I mean, that's natural. People are busy, people have busy schedules, but it became like a bit of a pattern. And then when I finally met with him, it was, oh, I had to take this phone call, or, oh, I'm looking at my phone the whole time, or, oh, like there just wasn't that interest there, that wasn't that connection there. And it took me a while to get there, because I was like, oh, this is a, senior vice president, and I have, a precious half hour with him, to be able to, glean all of this wonderful wisdom. And I don't want to give that up. I don't want to, let it go. But it took me some time to realize that, well, maybe it's just not the right fit, right? Maybe there's not, we're not meshing, we're not, the right fit, or maybe he's just not interested in
Yeah.
in giving his time to provide mentorship. Maybe that's, he's thinking about his own career, or he's thinking about his own mentors that he's talking to, that he's not in the position where he wants to, sort of give back, right? Or pay it forward, or whatever, whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it. It was like a sense that I developed over time. And I don't know if other folks have had, that similar experience. Maybe they hang on longer than I did, but I just chose to, end it because, I was able to then leverage other relationships that I had, that I was, able to nurture a bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. And, once you sort of finish that relationship there, you have the energy to put somewhere else, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then that hope grows into something a bit more rewarding for you. And the other thing you mentioned was the regularity of meetings and not actually waiting until you've hit a very sort of a significant point, but being consistent.
Yeah, I think that's so important, not only from a mentoring standpoint, but from an overall networking standpoint. One of the things, just kind of looking back on things that I've done and what I did right, what I did wrong over the course of my career, I do feel like the whole, keeping in regular contact with people and maintaining networks, even when you don't need them, is really important. And it doesn't always have to be, oh, I'm gonna, meet with this person, 1 hour every quarter or every 6 months. It could just be reaching out, right? It could just be a quick note or a quick email or a quick message on LinkedIn, just to say, hey, I'm checking in. Here's how I'm doing. Here's what I'm up to. Would love to hear more about what you're up to. And just kind of like maintaining that connection, I think is so important. And then that way, if you do need something, or you do want to make a connection with somebody else, or you do need advice, right? It's just easier to reach out. It's easier to reestablish that connection, versus, waiting 5 years and then contacting them again. Hey, remember me? And we worked together, that time. And kind of maintaining that. I apply that to the mentor relationships, as well as kind of broader networking. And you have to, sort of make time to do that, right? It's sort of like,
Yeah.
you make time for what's important. And I think that's pretty important.
The third thing that I really picked up on, which I thought was quite interesting, was you mentioned, so again, mentorship, we talk about in terms of changing your perception of things and developing your career. But actually, from a leader's perspective, you said mentorship was really useful for you because you having mentees allowed you to realize the problems they were facing, and maybe somebody else in your team was also facing those challenges. And I think that's quite important, from a leader's perspective, to see and to know what challenges their team faces, and making sure everybody has the support they need to keep progressing. So I thought that
Yeah.
was quite a nice point you made as well.
Yeah, it really helps to also understand, like, not only what's going on in people's minds when they're at work, but also kind of get the perspective of what's going on kind of behind the scenes as well. And it really did come to light during COVID, when we were all working from home. And you literally got a view into people's, living rooms or their kitchens or wherever, right? And you really started to understand that deeper perspective of what's going on with people in their lives. They would have, kids in the background doing homework, or they're kind of rushing off to do whatever they need to do. But to have that deeper perspective and understanding, especially about what's going on at work. And has it been some time since I was in their position, and now I have a better view and understanding of kind of what goes on and what they're facing. So it is, an issue, whatever the issue or problem it is that they're bringing to me to discuss. There's always something going on behind that as well, right? And it's able
Yeah.
to, dig down into that next layer, to really get the full understanding of what's happening.
The next thing I would really love to talk to you about is sort of movement into academia. So I think you've been teaching for quite some time now,
Yeah,
and you've got an MBA yourself, I believe.
I do. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're teaching on the MBA program. From the time you sort of did your MBA, right, and you saw the cohort you was with, compared to the students you teach now, and over that period of time, how have you seen students change or their sort of thinking of leadership change over that time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and there's so many different changes. A couple that come to mind. My big one that comes to mind is I think the MBA used to be thought of as something that um, graduates in business, whether it's accounting or marketing or finance, went on to have a deeper understanding of the business world. And so it became, a really kind of like a, sales, management, finance, accounting type of discipline. And that's largely how it was when I kind of went through it. And now it's evolved to, the first night of any class any course that I teach, I go around, have everybody introduce themselves and tell about their background and their jobs and what they do. And it's everything. In my last class, I had a dentist, an ophthalmologist, an engineer, a development, somebody who was in, athletic training, somebody who was in, traditional marketing, just the whole, different gamut of careers
Wow.
and interests and spreads. And I thought that's really interesting. This has been sort of a pattern for the last couple of years that I've been teaching for 8 years. So the last couple of years, I've really noticed this huge variety of different backgrounds and careers and skills. And then to kind of bookend it on the last night of class, I asked them to do, a reflection about the marketing class of, sort of what did you learn and how are you going to apply it, just so I can understand their perspective on it. And I get, this great, understanding of how, somebody who's an engineer who doesn't do marketing, right? They're, in R&D or product development, or they're writing code or whatever,
Yeah.
how they're going to think about marketing and the customer from their lens and from whatever work that they're doing. And they are finding ways to apply, what they're learning in the MBA to their roles. I do think a lot of them are enrolled in the MBA course to, sort of enhance their overall business understanding, but also to develop their leadership skills, right? Because a big part of, I think, what you get in an MBA program is, really honing those critical thinking skills, which I think are important in any career that you have. Typically in the U.S., folks will do an MBA after having worked a few years. Not always, right? I do have, some people who roll right out of undergraduate studies into an MBA program, but they've got some work experience, right? They've got, anywhere from 3 to 10 years of work experience, and so there's sort of this level of, now professional experience that they're kind of mixing in now more, postgraduate work, that helps them to develop that mindset and those critical thinking skills that I think are really important for leadership.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Peter. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. And I think there's points that you've mentioned that are absolutely invaluable. So thank you.
Great. You're welcome. It was a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for bringing up these important topics.